Hello, everybody. Welcome to another recording for History Value Podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Markus Vinzent, and today we're going to be having a discussion on the Ascension of Isaiah. So, Dr. Vinzent, the Ascension of Isaiah is a text that talks about Jesus' descent from heaven to earth, and it's claiming that Isaiah the prophet knew about this a long time ago, was claiming that he's predicting all of this, and as he goes through each layer of heaven to come closer and closer and closer to the earth, he becomes more and more vulnerable as he gets closer, or lower and lower in the levels of heaven. And then eventually he gets to the earth and he becomes vulnerable and he gets executed. Does this in some way remind you of the Epistle to the Philippians, which states that Paul, or whoever wrote it, is claiming that Jesus became a man, that he also pre-existed? Do you think this is in some way an expansion of what was said in that epistle?
Well, look, this is a good question because we assume today that this hymn in Philippians chapter 2 has been written as we have it in our canonical texts, has been written by Paul. Some claim, of course, that the hymn is even older than Paul and that Paul has just adopted it, probably adapted it slightly and inserted it in his letter to the Philippians. But I suggest we park that question to a later discussion that we can have here on the screen, because as I mentioned to you, I'm working right now on the earlier version of Philippians, of which we are told, which was part of the first collection, or at least the oldest that we know of, collection of Paul's letters. And in fact, this particular passage in Philippians 2 is much shorter in the what I think is the earlier version of Philippians that is part of this earlier collection of Paul's letters. And interestingly, this kind of a transformation and a descent of Jesus as told in Philippians 2 is missing to a large extent. So the question, I think, is rather what kind of a text do we have in the Ascension of Isaiah? And probably we then have to ask the question, once we have established how to place best to our knowledge of the Ascension of Isaiah, we then probably can also ask the other question, and I would love to do that at a later stage, how to fit Philippians into the development that we can see of people trying to understand and make sense of the figure of Jesus within a framework, which I would call a framework of Jewish mysticism in the 2nd century. With regards to your question, of course, about the Ascension of Isaiah, yes, indeed, we have this passage on the beloved, on the Son, on Jesus, in the Ascension of Isaiah, with all these transformations coming down from the pre-existing existence in heaven down to earth. But maybe for our listeners, it would be good to ask the other question. I mean, how is and what place does the beloved have in the Ascension of Isaiah, and to frame the context of the Ascension? But I leave the question to you.
And before I get to that question, could you answer it after this particular question that I want to focus on just real quick? And that is it correct that the Ethiopic manuscript of the Ascension of Isaiah is the oldest one that we have? Is that correct?
Yeah. Okay. And which means it's not that old, but on the other side, Ethiopian manuscripts are pretty close to and pretty meticulous in the copying of text. So even if you have a text from the 18th century as an Ethiopic manuscript, it doesn't mean that the text has been written in the medieval or even in modern period. So I think we have quite a reliable text, despite the language and the late dating of this manuscript.
The reason I asked that question is because some will say that there are differences between the Ethiopic version and the Latin and Slavonic versions of the text.
Which is true.
But are they serious
these differences are minor and really are rarely pertaining to the core of what we've got, which is also quite interesting because quite often we think, oh, well, these texts have been enormously altered. But in this case, I think, yes, the bigger claim of our critical editors, and we have a fantastic critical edition in the meantime of this text with a wonderful commentary volume on the text. The question is less about these meticulous or these subtle differences between what we've got in the manuscripts. The bigger issue that these editors had when they produced the critical edition and where they could not agree on was the prehistory of the text. So was this text originally a Jewish text? And we have the minority vote of Norelli, who was part of the editorial team, who stated in the critical edition that he could not accept the view of his other colleagues that this text was originally a Jewish text and then later reworked by a Christian who then would have inserted this passage that you mentioned with the descent of Christ. And his claim is that the entire text from the beginning, as we have it today, maybe with slight changes, has always been a Christian text. And this dispute between the editors has materialized in this edition, and you can see and read the minority statement of Norelli in the edition where he disagrees with his colleagues. So that's been an open question today, and I don't think anybody has really come up with a solution. And I've written a few articles on the Ascension of Isaiah, and in one of them, the latest one in 21, I also tried to make sense of the dispute and how we could potentially resolve the problem.
And just so that the audience knows, do you go with the compositional idea that the Ascension of Isaiah was written in stages and combined by an editor, or do you lean towards his idea, Enrico Norelli's idea?
No, I do think that interesting. I think both team partners, have something to say about the text. And the question which I'm asking and the solution I'm coming up with is that we could combine the two views. And I think both views, which is always the problem in early Christian and New Testament studies, both views which are contradictory because we are starting from the wrong foot. We are starting with an anachronistic view of the 2nd century. As long as you think that in the 2nd century, everything between Jews and Christians are largely settled, which means these are two separate communities, and we can single out people who we call Jews and other people who we call Christians. Then you come to this contradictory view on a text like the Ascension of Isaiah, where people who are leaning towards a bigger influence of Judaism come up with the idea that there is a Jewish text which has been interpolated by Christians. Whereas the other side, like Norelli, takes the view, oh no, Christians are so important, right? They were capable and even had the power to produce a text like the Ascension of Isaiah, and Christians were inherently Jewish. It's funny. I've just been asked this week to write an entry on a new German project, which is supposed to come out next year, which is called New Testament interpreted from the Jewish perspective. And this is exactly the same problem, right? The attempt of reading the New Testament, which they think is a Christian text, from the eyes of Jews. And I think, again, this is a contradiction in itself, because from my perspective, who sees Christian, if we can call them Christian, I mean, people who are called Christian by some other people rather than by themselves in the beginning, and even in the mid-second century, I mean, I'm not sure whether anybody except Marcion has come up with the idea of calling themselves Christians. I don't know of anybody earlier than him, and he is roughly mid-second century. So if we take the second century, and even if we take Justin, so right until the late or later second century, those people who we would call, bless you, we would call Christians, would regard themselves as being Jewish. Now, then to ask the question whether what they produce is Christian or Jewish is a non-starter. Of course, people who have lenience towards this Jesus and reflect upon his personality or his history, we would call Christians, but they themselves would see themselves as being entirely Jewish. Some circumcised, some uncircumcised, some closer to the one synagogue, others having their own synagogues. I think we're too much into this duality between isms. And I think that's one of the beauties of Daniel Boyarin's work, a good friend of mine, who came up with this book on no religion, who explains that the notion of Judaism is an invention probably as late as Justin Martyr, but even up until the medieval period, Jews would not see themselves as an ism. And this antagonism, which is implied by these dualisms that we produce, are dualisms which derive from the late medieval period and is a modern concept. So going back now to the question of the essential, when we face these sort of texts, we have to see them in a dense web of different traditions, which I would categorize as Jewish in the broad sense, even though that the players themselves, the agents, would see other people of their same, what we call same flock, would see other people not belonging to them and would have their own pocket where they would see themselves as the right Jews, or as Justin would say, Verus Israel, we are the true Israel. So that's the problem. If one takes that view, of course, the question becomes a completely different one. The question then is, what kind of influences such a text portrays? And I see in this text, particularly in the Ascension of Isaiah, a strong interest in the prophetic tradition. That's why it's called the Ascension of Isaiah. So there's less the interest of the descent of Christ, which is part of it, but the main focus of the text is a historical transposition of a reflection of its own time. And I may come to that, how best to contextualize this text. So this is the way I would like to see it. And then we can ask ourselves, what role does this Jesus and does this transformation of a heavenly Jesus into an earthly realm, what does it tell the readers and the listeners of this text about their own situation, and when would that best be placed? First century, second century, or later?
Yeah, I remember that one of your articles. Well, it's titled "The Ascension of Isaiah" as a response to Marcion, and you go into detail how you think that, well, not how, but why you think that the Ascension of Isaiah is a response to Marcion. Is these
That's an
and
interesting
so
question. You see, I haven't even mentioned Marcion once till now,
yeah,
because I
yeah,
wanted to
yeah.
flag
You
the.
did mention Marcion a moment ago, so it reminded me of my question. So that's what I wanted to go ahead and ask, as my was it's going to be part of my question of when it was written. Is I'm asking you,
Yeah.
what made you think that it's a response against Marcion, and is it because it looks to you that it's describing his views in a way, but it is also flipping his views also and trying to make them fit into Christianity and
Yeah.
canonical Christian
Very
doctrine?
good.
Okay.
Yeah. Very good question. When you start reading the Essential, right at the beginning, it makes a few claims what is at stake. And even the title itself indicates, as I mentioned before, the focus is on Jewish prophetism and picking the protagonist to be Isaiah, one of the three major prophets in the Jewish tradition. And it makes the claim throughout the text that Isaiah went to heaven and had a vision which was greater than anybody who had visions in the past and did so remaining in his body, because Josiah transcended the earthly body and had a pure vision according to this text. So it's superior to all people who had visions being in the body. Now, it seems to me this is a reference, a potential reference to the claim Paul makes, even the Paul in the earlier pre-canonical version in 2 Corinthians 12 and in a few other places, where he claims that he was lifted to the third heaven while he remained in his body, in his physical body, and listened to words and to what the voice was telling him in a way that even he couldn't speak about it, let alone write about it. So he just mentions that vision, but he takes from that vision the authority to be an apostle. And in early Christianity, it becomes clear that this was the inauguration of Paul to be an apostle and to be a reliable witness. This is quite interesting when you then look into the opening of Galatians. This is precisely where he draws on when he starts that he is an apostle not by human beings and not by means of somebody else, but
Right.
exclusively kat apokalypsin, because he had this vision. And why I do think that the Ascension is right from the opening a text which, on the one side, as I will show, relies on Marcion's ideas, but is on the other side also critical of some of the elements of it. And the authority of Paul is a major obstacle for this text. And it was the major foundation for Marcion's idea, because his claim was, of course, that Paul was the only authority. He rejected not just the Torah, he rejected even more firmly that any prophet of the past, any Jewish prophet, had any idea about the upcoming Messiah. So you can see the dissents that the Essential right from the beginning makes by picking one of the major prophets. Secondly, by rejecting or deposing Paul as the sole authority and elevating Isaiah above Paul. I think he wouldn't have mentioned, or the author wouldn't have mentioned in the Ascension of Isaiah, this notion that the vision is a non-physical one, if he had not in mind another authority that has claimed that he had a vision in his physical state. So this is a frank opposition, I think, which becomes clear from the beginning. Maybe we have also to explain to our listeners that the way earth and heaven were staged in antiquity was quite fluid. I mean, we have people who reckon with 3 heavens, and we have people who reckon with 10 or 7 heavens, and even more heavens. And here again, when Paul speaks about 3 heavens, that he was lifted up to the 3rd heaven, it could either mean he was lifted up to the highest heaven, because he only mentions 3. But I think it makes more sense in the light of the ideas about the number of heavens in antiquity, that what he wants to say is that he was lifted to the 3rd heaven, which was usually the beginning of the divine sphere. So it was just the transitional beginning. Hence, he wasn't lifted up fully into the divine realm. He was just lifted up to, let's say, where you were able to touch the first elements of the divinity. And again, Isaiah is more daring, and he surpasses Paul's ascent. He is lifted up to the 7th heaven. So far beyond, more than double the amount of poor Paul. And therefore, he claims he had a more elaborate, a more divine and a clearer insight in the divine realms. So that's the staging in the beginning. And you can see, why do I think it is Marcion as the opponent and not somebody else, Cerinthus or any from the Valentinians? Right. There's only one theologian in the 2nd and 3rd century who makes the specific claim that he rejects the entire Torah and the prophets. So neither Cerinth, nor Valentinian, nor Ptolemaeus, anybody else we know of, has ever made the claim that he's going to replace the Torah and the prophets, while still wanting to stay within the Jewish realm. So that's the other thing we need to bear in mind. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And this was a daring new concept. And I think it is part and parcel already of a kind of Jewish mysticism. I mean, we have that later in Hasidism, we have it in the Kabbalah, that people are not rejecting, probably that's then later no longer possible, but thinking about their own visions more authoritative than any kind of traditional writings of the Jewish tradition. But this is an early form, I think, both of Marcion and what we then read in the Ascension, of this kind of a mystical replacement of the traditional writings. Now, maybe I'm talking too much, so but ask your question.
Well, no, it's okay. I was just going to ask about that in your second article. Well, the page number on it is it says 210. So is you say here you're quoting, I will wipe Jesus. Excuse me. It says, I will wipe Jerusalem clean, just as one wipes a plate on both sides. I will abandon this last remaining tribe among my people and hand them over to their enemies. They will be plundered and robbed by all their enemies. The prophetism also speaks about Manasseh's killing of many innocent people, of staining Jerusalem with their blood from end to end, who read this story in the aftermath of the Jewish war in the year 6670 CE, and even more after the devastation of Jerusalem and in the second Jewish war, the Bar Kokhba revolt of the years 132-135 CE, would not have been linked to these prophecies, or to these events, would not have linked this prophecy to these events. You put that there as a question mark. So you think that the Ascension of Isaiah is not only a response to the first war, but also to the other war, the Bar Kokhba revolt. So it's not just having Marcion in mind. It's viewing the Bar Kokhba revolt as some kind of huge, massive apocalypse on Jerusalem, greater than the one that occurred earlier.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why Marcion is just one element in the background of this Ascension of Isaiah. I see even both. I mean, both Marcion and the author of the Ascension of Isaiah as trying to deal with this situation of a situation which was aggravated through these number of wars with the Romans. I mean, as I mentioned in an earlier session that we had together, the first war in the 66 and 70 in the first century was a defeat, of course, of the Jews, no doubt. They lost first of all their own temple tax, which was deviated to the Roman treasury. They lost anything that was in the temple. The temple was burnt down, as Josephus in detail explains. However, having lost the temple, they didn't lose their infrastructure. They didn't lose the city. They didn't lose the high priesthood, the Sanhedrin. So let me say, take the example of Ukraine today. Yeah, yes, you lost a lot of land, or you lost a lot of treasures, and you lost a lot of people, of course. Yeah, but you didn't lose your identity. You were fighting, and that's the reason why after this first war we have a second war almost just 1 or 2 generations later. So people were still in place.
Right.
People had a coherence. People were fighting, and particularly they were fighting for the rebuilding of the temple. So the idea was still alive that this is a community which stays in the land and which is working and fighting to get the temple back. So the focus was not the Torah. The focus was not the prophets. The focus was the Torah. And this you can even see in the coinage of Bar Kokhba from the year 2. You will see that the inscriptions on his coins read that the temple will be rebuilt. So I think this was central to the message of the second, and which also led to the second Jewish war. Hence, when we compare what is being said in the Ascension of Isaiah as a scenario, we no longer have that focus on the temple. Now the temple is entirely destroyed. There is no hope left. It is utter destruction, and it is dissemination. People are dispersed. This is a text for the diaspora. This is a text which tries to reconfigure Jewish practice at a place and in a stage where there are no longer sacrifices possible. And what is the refocusing of Jewish practice in this situation? It is clinging to the written tradition, to Jewish scriptures, to the Torah, but even more importantly than the Torah, it is the prophets. And at the same time, it is a big claim and blame, which is even harsher than what we read in Josephus. I mean, Josephus says, yeah, the Pharisees, they all messed it up. And at the end of the day, it was the Jews' own fault that the temple got lost. They should have stayed in cooperation and collaboration with the Romans, just as he does himself, being well paid from the Romans. So he writes, this would have been the way to avoid the catastrophe. The Ascension is different. The Ascension says it is Jewish leadership. And he makes this historical transposition by placing his description into the 8th century before our era. So he takes Ezechia and he takes Manasseh. Manasseh, this terrible leader and king of the Jews, who is being described in the 2nd book of Kings. And actually, he's quite whitewashed in the book of Chronicles. But in the 2nd book of Kings, he is a destroyer of the temple in a different way. He introduces a pagan practice, idolatry, and the Ascension makes the claim, hence, it is not just the Pharisees, not just a group amongst Jews, it's the highest leadership which failed the Jews. And again, that wouldn't apply for the First Jewish War, but it applies utterly to the Second Jewish War. It is a messianic claim that this bodily Messiah, Simon bar Kokhba, and with him, the leaders, the Sanhedrin, and all the leading people were engaged. We know some disagreed with the moves they made, but it was perceived by the Romans and apparently also by a lot of Jews as being the sort of Putin leadership. Yeah, I mean, disastrous military decisions, with the result that they didn't lose just the temple, but that Hadrian, in his last days of his emperorship, decided that the Jews had to abandon and be banned from the city of Jerusalem and the nearer outskirts. So from this moment onwards, Jews had lost the entire infrastructure. No pilgrims in what usually took place every year. No pilgrimage any longer. No Sanhedrin. No high priesthood. No sacrifices. Jews, as they knew their own identity, had lost. Mm-hmm. And this is the situation the Ascension of Isaiah is addressing. And the solution that's being proposed is a mystical solution. It transposes Jerusalem into heaven. And it takes Isaiah as the prophet who announces not just a Christian Messiah, which is then a counter Messiah to Simon bar Kokhba. It is a Messiah who is no longer a physical body like Simon bar Kokhba. He is an angelic figure who transforms siderically from the move and in the move down and becomes more and more a human being. While in reality, which is good Jewish, he is something like the Shekhinah, like an angelic presence in this world. And you see, here comes the parallelism, which is no antagonism in this case, a parallelism to Marcion's solution, which is actually exactly the same. It is a Jesus not born in a physical way, but derived from heaven. Now, I do think that the Ascension of Isaiah knows our canonical texts of the New Testament, so particularly the Gospels, and most particularly the birth stories in Matthew and Luke, because the author plays with it. And he takes these birth stories, but he dematerializes it. So Mary indeed gives birth to an angel. And she doesn't really give birth, if you like. Yeah, I mean, he just plops out and pops his way into the world without physical danger or pain or whatever to Mary. And it's also interesting, the Ascension even discusses that the midwives in the village propose all sorts of explanations how this child comes to birth. So we know that there was a lot going on amongst Jews who reflected upon how a Messiah could come in a non-physical way. And I think it is an opposition to a physical Messiah figure as they had it in Simon Bar Kokhba with this devastating result. And that's the parallelism between the Ascension and Marcion. So I do think both texts derive from a similar environment, although they come then up with opposite, in some ways, opposite solutions. The one, Isaiah, the Ascension of Isaiah, claiming that the prophets had already foreseen this misery of the Jews of the time, and therefore have placed an angelic leader, a new Messiah, who is going to restore Israel and replace leadership by having a new form of leadership, of elders and so forth. And all that comes in, which then we would identify as Christian structures. Marcion is very similar in this regard as well. He also thinks that what he then himself for the first time calls Christians are these Jews in establishing their own new forms of leadership, both, of course, without temple, both with this kind of a mystical idea of an angelic figure. The difference being Ascension Isaiah is critical of the Jewish writings insofar as it is critical of people like Manasseh and other people. Marcion is critical of the entire bunch of the traditions in those writings, because he sees that a kind of messianism like Simon Bar Kokhba was based on those Jewish writings like the book of Daniel, who claimed that the Messiah had to destroy these opponents. The Ascension takes the view that wasn't the mistake. The mistake was it was the wrong Messiah. So, if you like, Marcion has a more radical view with regards to their own and his own Jewish tradition, whereas the Ascension of Isaiah tries to go only halfway in criticizing the past. And if we want to add Josephus is even less critical about the past, because he singles out some groups or a few people who were responsible for the first war, and probably he would have come up with a similar solution had he lived through the Second Jewish War.
So when we look at the manuscripts, and you were saying earlier about the differences are relatively minor between the Ethiopic version, and the Latin and Slavonic versions. And so one question one of the questions I have in regard to that is the virgin birth of Jesus, is his birth mentioned in all versions of this text? Is it in the other two texts, or is it one of the texts that's missing?
That I would need to check again with regards to the text. It's a while ago that I wrote this article about Jesus' birth, and where the comparison between the manuscripts and also a comparison between the different solutions of the early church. So I can't answer that question right now. But if I remember and recollect correctly, then the issue all of the manuscripts are displaying is that, according to this text, it is a virgin birth, which means it is not a physical one. But with some reluctance. I'm saying I would love to have a look at the manuscripts again.
And in all versions, is it true that in all versions that Jesus, as he gets lower and lower, he gets more vulnerable and more vulnerable. When he gets to the earth, he's executed. Is this in all versions of the text?
Yeah, as far as I remember, yes.
So in other words, there are no other text or other version of the text claiming that Jesus died in heaven.
No.
Okay.
I mean, this is a let's say this is a conclusion which you only can draw if you are seriously taking the idea that he is not a human body like you and me, that he remains an angelic figure. And this is another parallelism between what we've got in the Ascension of Isaiah and in Marcion. In Marcion, he also dies. He dies on the cross, no doubt. And yet, and that's one of the reasons why quite a number of people still think he is part of the Gnostic movement, although I don't believe in the existence of a Gnostic movement. But what is certainly right is that one of the explanations people had was that this angelic figure can suffer and doesn't really suffer, that he can die and he doesn't die.
I ask those questions because there are some people out there that are claiming that the text is about is portraying Jesus as someone that was crucified in heaven, and he was never on earth. He never stepped foot on earth. It this whole thing has happened in heaven, like almost as if it's a full blown Docetist kind of text. But I know from reading it and also from the other versions, I do know that is false, and that's also the reason I asked you because I was pretty certain that you were going to give identical answers to what I already knew from reading the text. Is that this doesn't appear to be that way, and that's the reason I asked you earlier if the Ethiopic version is the oldest one that we have. Not necessarily to say that it doesn't predate the Ethiopic version, because I know it's just a manuscript copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, but but the reason I asked you that question is because some of these people place such emphasis on the other two versions that we're talking about here, the Latin and Slavonic version, that I think it's a huge problem for them. Not only does it not really say what they're saying in the first place in any version of the text, but the Ethiopic version, which is where the complete translation is pretty much based upon, is the oldest one. So they can't really win there either way.
Yeah, and look, I would be even more daring to say, even if we had versions of this text, or if we had other texts, right, who speak about a heavenly birth or a heavenly death of Jesus, then these would be alternative solutions to the problem. We are not establishing here the solution. What is quite interesting is that, and we can see it already when we compare two witnesses like this author of the Ascension of Isaiah and the Marcionite text. People were frightened with the idea what to do after the devastating result of these lost wars. And they had to reinvent themselves. And of course, what I'm trying to convey is that we have a whole range of ideas how best to cope and how best to live one's life as Jews. And there might be and might have been not just one original text of the Ascension. I think even that is an obsession with original texts. I mean, these texts were texts in practice. There were texts which were told reported, written, copied, altered, and so forth and so forth. And it would be a surprise that we have some people claiming, oh, well, what we have experienced in Israel is a nightmare. And it's just to show the physical impossibility that matter in this world can do any good. When people are composed just of matter, they end up as grinder or grinded meat in battles. Yeah. And if we are just relying on physical leaders, then we're ending up with wars. And hence the mystical tradition, which would then claim, oh, well, we have a Messiah who is entirely heavenly, and that's paradisic. And he might have come to touch on earth, but he has never really been alive, has never died. This is all a process of what we have as a heavenly world. But yeah, we might have that range of options, yeah. And but Peter Schäfer is very skeptical. He's the best scholar with knowledge on early Jewish mysticism, and he disagrees with Gershom Scholem, the other almost founder of mystical studies within the Jewish tradition. And Peter Schäfer doesn't accept Scholem's suggestion that we have already in the 2nd century, let alone in the New Testament writings of Christians, an early stage of Jewish mysticism. But I think that problem is being solved when we move the New Testament writings into the 2nd century. Then probably Peter Schäfer even would have admitted that we can see the parallel scenarios, that even the New Testament writings, we have these eschatological views, and the development of early Jewish mysticism as part of the Christian tradition, which then carries on throughout the centuries. So to answer your question, it wouldn't be a problem for me if we found versions or even other texts, and we certainly have texts. Just take the Apocryphon of John, which sees Jesus as an entirely mystical figure, dancing around and having visions, and certainly not something one would have experienced on this earth. But the problem we have in the 20th and 21st century, and that's quite a lot of listeners to your channel, I think, is that we always want to ask the historical question: how did it happen? What kind of a physical person Jesus, Paul, and the early apostles have been? And then we search for physical answers to birth and death, and we ask the historical question about resurrection and about the beginnings of the church. And to all these questions, almost our entire literature of the first 2, 3, 4 centuries, and probably even later, does not want to answer. Because this is not the question or the sort of questions these texts have been written for. These texts are setting out scenarios. Therefore, the Ascension of Isaiah has its play in the 8th century before our era. So it's not about the 8th century before our era, but it's like a staged play which pretends a scenario from the 8th century before our era. But right now it explains what happens in the mid-2nd century. And likewise, when we have the New Testament writings, we have texts that stage a 1st century setting to explain how to live a Jewish life in the mid-2nd century.
Here's my final question. When do you think that the Ascension of Isaiah was edited and put together to the text that we have now? Do you think this already occurred in the 2nd century CE, or is this a bit later?
No, I think that there's a good reason to believe that it is in the later 2nd century, because we can only see that with regards to what is being addressed, the questions that are addressed. And we have this quest for a new identity in the years between the end of the Second Jewish War. You can see it in Aristides, we can see it in Justin, we can see it in texts which are more easily datable. We also have it in Ptolemaeus and in a few other figures. So I think this fits well into what is called the Christian form of second sophistics. So it's the time, I would say, between 140 and maybe 170. When we come to Irenaeus, and when we come from Irenaeus to Tertullian and Origen, we come to a different form of thinking, a different form of referencing. New questions come in, and one of the big questions then from the 170, which is missing in this text, is the descent between Christians and Jews. That's something you don't find in the Ascension, and that's why we have this debate between the editors, whether it's a Jewish text slightly remodeled, or whether it's an entirely Christian text. Because from the times after Justin, the question comes, and we can see that in the 7 letters of Ignatius, the question comes, how can we more clearly differentiate between what Christians say against what Jews say? So setting Jews, not just as in Marcion, setting Jews as an antithesis, but setting Christians against Jews, that you don't find in the Ascension of Isaiah, and you won't find in Marcion. It's a difference to claim your own pocket in the group that is still practicing forms of Jewish life, and it is another thing to believe that one has already one's own pocket with one's own label, which is set against and claims the heritage of the others.
Let me add just one more small question. In chapter 8, verse 17 in the Ascension of Isaiah, actually it's verse 18, excuse me. It says, and there they all named the primal Father and his beloved, the Christ and the Holy Spirit, all with one voice. There are some scholars that think that this is a reference to the Trinity. What do you think of this?
Oh, they are certainly right. But having studied the development of early Christian texts, when it comes to the theological entities like a doxology, so the praise of the Father, Son, and Spirit, for example, at the end of prayers or at the end of texts, and the same within texts when there's mention of, let's say, the Father. This is prone to be manipulated and rewritten in light of later theological developments. I've just published a piece on in a marvelous set by Jens Schröter. Jens Schröter in Berlin, the New Testament scholar. He has published a few volumes on the reception of the figure of Jesus in early Christian writings right to the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. And I contributed one chapter on that, which was on the Traditio Apostolica, one of our early catechisms. And here again, we have Ethiopic, we have Syriac, we have Coptic translations, and a variety of other languages where we can compare the text. And it's so obvious that whenever it comes to naming the divine, in those places, the manuscripts differ. And you can almost see, I mean, you can compare what is being said. You can reference that with the councils of the time, and you can see roughly in which area and time things were written.
So
I'll give you
basically,
another example. Yeah, I give you another example. We have the Ignatian letters. And when we take just the letter to the Romans, which exists in a Syriac manuscript as part of a 3-letter collection, and then we have the Greek, the Latin, Syriac, Coptic, and other versions from the 7-letter collection, and the Arabic even translation of Romans. When we compare those, the Syriac, which seems to be reflecting the oldest stratum of these letters, when it starts in the beginning and mention is made that the Romans are to be praised because and through the Lord, the Father. That's all. In the 7-letter collection, that's been changed into praise is to the Father and the Lord. And we have a large section then just 2 verses later where the Lord is being explained again, which is missing in the Syriac. Now, who would cut out Jesus Christ from Christian text? Unbelievable, yeah. So this is a later edition. And when we come to the same sort of text in the 5th century, late 4th century probably, now we have the Holy Spirit becoming prominent in the text, because that's the time of the discussion of these topics. So you can see these texts, particularly when it comes to theological statements, are the most variable parts in otherwise relatively stable texts.
so basically, you're saying that somebody played with that verse that we just talked about, and they twist the wording a little bit to reflect the Trinity.
Yeah, I think that is probably 3rd, 4th century that those changes are usually being made. I mean, sometimes a bit earlier.
Okay.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.